Hello and welcome back. I guess that's my shtick now since I seem to be starting my last couple videos like that. Again, I am Hannah. I am recently adding this whole YouTube video component to my book blog on a little bit of happiness. I'll include that link down below. And this week, like I said, I am breaking a little bit from my resolution. I just read 3 nonfiction books and I needed a little bit of fiction in my life. And so I turned to Rafi Middlefett's, I apologize if I butchered it, but his book, What Makes Us. It is a very entertaining story. It's definitely kind of more in the YA realm, but what I think is really important about it is it's very realistic in that the characters don't seem too far-fetched. They don't seem too extra. They seem to be very much of this time and of this place. They seem very relatable. So a little bit about the book. It follows Aaron Sharon, and he is of Jewish descent and living in Texas, assumingly now. Just based off some of the context clues, such as they reference Trump, they reference MAGA hats, that sort of thing. So, mild spoiler alert, potential trigger warning. This book does deal with some racial, ethnic tensions, and if that makes you a little uncomfortable, just keep that in mind if you do choose to read this book. That said, it's super entertaining, and I think it really lends to the story well and helps it develop into what I think is a pretty impactful read. Something I thought was very interesting about it is that throughout the book, Aaron is trying to figure out who he is. A large part of that is because he feels that he is angry all the time, that he has a short fuse, and it doesn't help that when he organizes a protest for, I'm assuming a fictional traffic law, I didn't find anything online about it, he gets in trouble, everything blows up, and some reporters dig up some old controversial news reports about something his father had done, which makes everyone kind of turn against Aaron. They pull the whole go back to your country because he's got brown skin and his mom has an Israeli accent. And so there's just a lot going on in this book, and he's just trying to find himself. While he's trying to find himself, there are a couple of other characters who are also kind of trying to figure out the same thing. One of the other characters that I really liked and that they focus on a lot is this girl named Jade, who is a classmate of Aaron's, and she has lived her whole life with a very overprotective mother, and she doesn't really understand why. And her mother is just kind of a little bit of a mystery to her. She doesn't really understand what's going on to make her mom this way, and she thinks it's because of who she is. And that's because, a little bit of a spoiler, she's kind of been lied to. She isn't necessarily who she thinks she is. And so her identity is then kind of called into question. And I think that's a super interesting thing that Middlefett did in the book, was he asked his characters to be self-reflexive, to explore who they are and what their identity is. It's not your typical coming-of-age book, like Perks of Being a Wallflower. Love that book. But it's not that kind of storyline where you find out who you love or you find out more about yourself. This is a book where you're literally finding out who you are. Imagine if you grew up thinking your dad was one person, and then all of a sudden someone else, not even your mom, tells you that he's someone entirely different. That's what happens to Aaron in this book. And Jade, in a similar way, finds out that her parents were keeping secrets from her about who she is and about their family. And that's really rough for her to take. And so I think that's just a really cool thing that Middlefelt chose to do in this book. I think it's super well written. It too was a pretty quick read. I was super interested in it the whole time. And something else kind of cool about this book is that it shifts perspective, which I think is really interesting. Now, I've talked a number of times in a few of my other blogs about shifting focalization. And some of them I provided a link that kind of explains that, but simply put, focalization shifts are when we kind of change the point of view that the narrator is coming from. Sometimes that's super obvious, like in this book where it says at the beginning of the chapter who's talking. Sometimes it's kind of like, think of in a movie when you're in like a chase scene, for example, and you see one car and what's happening in that car, and then it switches to the pursuing car, like the cop car or whatever, and you see what's happening there. That's a focalization shift. And the same thing happens in this book. It's just more dramatic because it just more fully changes who's talking, who's thinking through things, who's experiencing what. Sometimes, depending on how it's done, depending on how frequently that focalization shifts, I get kind of annoyed, but I think this was done really artfully well because as far as Aaron goes, it gives context to his story when it shifts between him and his mom, because it gives that context of his father and how his father's infamous legacy is affecting him now. But it's also kind of interesting because when it shifts to Jade, because then it kind of gives more context to the whole situation in this little Texas town as it's unfolding. So really enjoyed the book. Definitely recommend. Kind of like my last book, it is a teen book, but I didn't notice, so don't let that dissuade you and make you think that you're too old for it for whatever reason, because it was really enjoyable, and I think it teaches everybody a really good lesson about mindfulness, not only about who we are, but who we portray ourselves to be, and mindful that how others portray themselves doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they are. So I think there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from this book, but I think it's also just a really entertaining read that pretty much everyone would probably enjoy. So thank you again. Look out for my blog and my video next week. I'll be reading The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. I just got this for Christmas and kind of like this last book. I was really drawn in by the cover and think it looked pretty cool. So I'll let you know my thoughts then. Thank you and see you later.